In today's episode of the Mind Forest podcast, we focus on the middle way with our guest, Robert Ellis. Robert is a philosopher, prolific author, academic, and founder of the Middle Way Society. I was inspired to record a solo episode on the concept of the middle way, which has really impacted my way of thinking and been a reliable and comforting psychological aid in times of unbalance, insecurity, and information overload. But in my research, I came across Robert's work and I thought, I've just got to get him on the show. I really admire his commitment to critical thinking and his rejection of all kinds of dogma. His journey through Buddhism and out the other side reflects his ability to embrace concepts that he can stand behind, yet reject those he's still uneasy with, regardless of in-group pressures. In an age of information overload in which we are bombarded from all sides, now more than ever it's crucial we're able to engage critical thinking, avoid extreme opinions, and maintain our psychological balance. Like most people, I came to understand the middle way through Buddhism, being one of the core pillars of Buddhist philosophy. However, the Middle Way Society is inspired by many disciplines, as we touch on in this episode. So I'll just read you this quote from the Middle Way Society website that explains the society and their goals. The Middle Way Society was founded to promote the study and practice of the Middle Way. The Middle Way is an idea that we can make judgments by avoiding fixed beliefs and by being open to practical experience. We challenge unhelpful distinctions between facts and values, reason and emotion, religion and secularism, or arts and science. Though our name is inspired by some insights of the Buddha, we are independent of Buddhism or any religion. We seek to promote and support integrative practice, overcoming conflict of all kinds. Robert is someone who you can tell has just engaged with a hugely wide variety of ideas, and I really admire his honesty, his intellectual honesty. He's somebody who you sense will critically think about almost anything and come to a conclusion and avoid dogma, like I mentioned. So I think it's a really interesting discussion. And in today's episode, we discuss extremes of religion, critical thinking skills, Buddhist philosophy, the Middle Way Society itself, and the differences between nihilism and eternalism. So we do get into some philosophical weeds at points. Stay with us. Hopefully we navigate our way through enough for it to be an interesting conversation. I'll leave plenty of information about the Middle Way Society in the show notes. They run retreats, they run online groups, they've got their own podcast with many different writers, speakers, academics coming in from all disciplines. Lastly, you can see more of the Mind Forest content at Mind Forest Podcast on Instagram or Mind Forest Philosophy on YouTube. You can also find us on Spotify, so do give us a follow to see some of our other interviews, and we've got a whole host of content coming up. So that's all for now. Without any further introduction needed, let's dive in. So hi Robert, thank you for coming on the Mind Forest podcast. Appreciate your time today. As I mentioned to you before we got going, I was looking at recording a solo episode of the podcast on the middle way, or the middle path, being the theme that I wanted to focus on. The reason being it was the only kind of philosophy or heuristic, if you like, that I could think of that I felt really applied to nearly every area of life, and I'd found it very hard to disprove. And as we get into the weeds, that might be because of the way it's worded, or that might be because it has real value. But yeah, I stumbled across your work, the Middle Way Society, in my research, and realized that there was a whole body of work around this, and someone who dedicated their life, from what I can see, to fleshing this out and advocating it. So yeah, really excited to talk to you about it all. So I guess I just thought I'd sort of start by asking bit of a general question, but could you give us a bit of an idea of how, firstly, what is your understanding of the middle way, and how has it become the kind of central theme of your academic life, at least?
Well, thanks for having me on. Yeah, what's my understanding of the middle way? Well, the way I generally put it is that it's a principle of judgment, so it's something we apply as a matter of practice from moment to moment. So at any point we can apply the middle way in the way we respond to whatever strikes us, whatever we encounter. and it involves the avoidance of absolutes or absolute assumptions on either side. So one of the key understandings or insights in it is the recognition that there are paired, polarized, opposed absolutes, rather than just one kind of problem to avoid. They usually come in pairs of absolute assumptions. The path, as I see it, involves trying to find that open middle ground, where we can use our experience effectively to respond to whatever we encounter. So that's a very brief potted start, if you like, as to what I think the middle way is. As to how I got into it, I better start with a bit about my background. So I started off, I suppose, going back to my first degree back in Cambridge in the 1980s. I started studying Oriental religions, Buddhism and Hinduism, and also philosophy, religious studies. But then I went into teaching religious studies for a while. But there was a point there where I began to get interested in the middle way as an idea. This is probably around the 1990s. I mean, it arose also out of my involvement with Buddhism and Buddhist practice, which also happened early in my life around the time I was an undergraduate. And I have had a rather sort of love-hate relationship with Buddhism as a tradition, and with the particularly the Triratna tradition, Triratna movement, which I was involved with. And so the middle way is something I learned about initially through Buddhism, but it rapidly began to seem to me that it was a sort of underdeveloped area of Buddhism, or that it hadn't really been worked out how it applied, particularly in the West, in the modern world. And I began to see it as a way of navigating between, well, particularly I was concerned with relativism and absolutism in ethical terms to start with. So that was the problem that I began to think about, particularly in the 1990s, and also because I encountered it in my work in teaching religious studies, that people, both students and teachers in religious study, tended to either absolutely appeal to the truth of a religious tradition or be relativist and assume that all religious traditions were in some sense of equal value. And both of those seem to me to be mistaken approaches. So what was the alternative, and why did people tend to be sucked into those two polarized extremes all the time? So that was why I became interested in. So I decided to study that for a PhD. So that was probably the decisive point where my work started in 97, when I started studying for a PhD at Lancaster, which I finished in 2001 on, well, I called it a Buddhist theory of moral objectivity at the time, but it was about the middle way. And yeah, that was only really the starting point. I began to bring together different strands of thinking about the middle way, about the Western philosophy. First, I was navigating in relation to different Western philosophers, but rapidly also I began to recognize the importance of psychology in relation to that, and bringing the psychology into contact with the philosophy. Gradually, as I've gone on since then, I've also incorporated neuroscience, systems theory, embodied meaning. Those will become important parts of my understanding of what the middle way involves. So really, what I do is synthesize the different insights I get from those different directions in relation to what's basically a practical outlook, which I've got, particularly from Buddhism, from Buddhist practice as a starting point. But I'm no longer committed to the Buddhist tradition. So whether that means I'm Buddhist depends on how you define the term Buddhist. But I've described myself as a middle way practitioner, and make of that what you will. So since my PhD, I've been working on refining and developing that middle way philosophy. And in 2013, I started the Middle Way Society to get other people involved and try to stimulate, thinking and practice of the Middle Way. So that's not only like a discussion area for the Middle Way and developing understanding of the Middle Way, but it's also a place where we get together to practice it. And so retreats have been an important part of that since its inception. And like 18 months ago, I moved to where I am now, which is Tyrrell House, which is a large house in South Wales, in the Brecon Beacons, where together with my wife, we've turned into a small retreat centre. So part of the vision for that is holding middle way society retreats and being able to offer, stronger face-to-face experiences where people can get into the middle way, not only understanding it, but also practicing it. And maybe just to mention the sort of final recent thing which engages me is there's a whole ecological dimension to this, I think, and how we can use the middle way to respond to our current multiple crises, a lot of which is particularly involved with, I think, food production and the way we use the land. So one of the things we're doing here at Tyrrell House is we've got 17 acres of land, and I'm developing a forest garden, which has become an all-encompassing interest for me in the last year or so. But there's certainly an application of the middle way there is in the way we try to address the conditions of all the things that are going on in the environment and the land, and how they impact the way we meet our needs by growing food as part of a system, an interactive and interdependent system.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, that's a really comprehensive download on sort of your journey. Appreciate that. Quite a few things to flesh out and touch on there. The first one that kind of struck me was you spoke about using the middle way to approach religion. So for somebody who's kind of new to the middle way, can you kind of flesh out for us how, maybe you can use an example of a certain religion, but how, for example, would you approach a religious discussion and find a way between dogma or relativism? Is in my understanding, it would be that we have to rely on our own experience and approach each problem as it on their own. Is that fair?
That's right. Yes, the reliance on experience is key. I suppose the middle way is particularly focused on getting absolutization, what I call absolutization, or absolute thinking, out of the way, if you like, so that we can allow ourselves to learn from experience. Obviously there is a whole scientific tradition which has developed, which has enabled us to try to justify our beliefs, particularly our general beliefs, our theoretical beliefs, from experience. But it's one thing to make use of that tradition, but another to apply it fully in one's own life and one's own judgment. So there's something of the best elements of science there, I think, in the middle way of judgment, if one judges in a provisional way about what one encounters. But at the same time, that scientific tradition has often been seen as opposed to religious tradition. And yeah, there's a whole way in which people have encountered meaning and inspiration from religious traditions, which is not captured if you have a kind of reductive or scientistic account of religion as, for example, just fulfilling human social purposes, or even as part of a material causal explanation, whatever. Those things have explanatory value, but they're only part of the picture. How I approach religious traditions is to try and say, at one and the same time, we don't need absolute beliefs. Absolute beliefs are not actually relevant to what religious traditions are offering us, although they have captured a great deal of the discussion and the way people tend to think about them. Instead, I'm very much inspired by Jung to think archetypally about the symbols of religious traditions, and to see religious traditions as sources of inspiration, which are reminders of a more integrated perspective that we may have encountered at various points. Well, we undoubtedly have probably encountered at different points in our experience. But because we're so varied, so subject to so many different conditions which thrust us this way and that, we tend to forget what most inspires us or what most integrates our perspective. So one of the key elements of practice, I think, is just staying in touch with that source of inspiration. And that's where religious traditions have really, I think, functioned helpfully for people through the ages. So they can come back to what they feel is most valuable, which anchors them in a practical sense. So that function, I think, is entirely distinguishable from beliefs about absolutes, as well, beliefs about the universe, beliefs about supernatural entities like God. Yeah, anything that's any claims that are made beyond experience are just not necessary to that process of inspiration. But to bring those two things together, that religion as meaning and inspiration at the same time as avoiding absolute beliefs, requires, a number of different practices coming together. I mean, I talk about the practice of agnosticism, which is a kind of defensive practice, really not being sucked into absolute beliefs and their fruitless battles with each other. And that's also related to other principles of the middle way that I talk about. So skepticism, provisionality, incrementality, and integration. So it's all connected with a whole set of practices that we might use to try and support us in that path.
Nice. And so I think someone hearing this off the bat, they could assume the middle way is very much a form of empiricism, that you're only allowing people to accept truths from their own experience. Is that fair, or is there also space for what might be seen as rationalism, your own insights before experience?
I think both rationalism and empiricism can be reductive and absolutized philosophical views. Obviously, there's an interaction between the frameworks and the concepts we use on the one hand all the time, and the experiences we have. I mean, as Kant pointed out 200 years ago, you just can't have one without the other. They're constantly interacting. So in some ways, it's just silly trying to isolate them from one another. So we do have to keep tacking back and forth, recognizing that we're framing things a particular way, and maybe we don't have to frame things in that way. Maybe there are alternatives. But at the same time, coming back to what experience has offered us, and using that as a basis of reconsidering our beliefs. So I mean, that's related to what I talk about, the integration of meaning and the integration of belief. So as allied processes. So on the one hand, we need to be able to connect new possibilities, our understanding of new possibilities, our imagination of new possibilities, to what we already think about and what we already feel. So that's the integration of meaning. And on the other hand, we also need a critical process to be able to think about what the most justified beliefs are on balance as we go on. And all of that can involve weighing up any aspect of experience. Yeah, so it's certainly not empiricism in any kind of narrow scientific sense. We need to take into account our intuitions and our personal experiences, as well as scientific information, for example. None of them offer the whole story. They're part of the picture that we need to weigh up.
That makes sense. One thing you've touched on a couple of times already, and I can see is key to all of this, is critical thinking skills, which are probably slightly lacking in sort of today's society in some ways, and especially with social media now and the bombardment of information we have. I believe critical thinking is more important than ever, because we are simply just bombarded with more information. It's more extreme, and it feels like things are just speeding up. So what do you think are some of the cornerstones of critical thinking that someone would have to have necessarily to be able to apply this sort of middle way philosophy? Are there any sort of cornerstones you would start from?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've done in my earlier teaching career is teach critical thinking as a subject, and that's certainly informed my whole approach. Yeah, I mean, the various key elements, I think, to critical thinking, but most generally, I think it's about contextualizing. So you've got some possible beliefs you're considering, maybe an argument that someone else is putting forward, or an argument you're considering for yourself. And do you just accept that as it is because it seems plausible, or do you consider it in relation to other possibilities and weigh up in some sense how strong it is, or how justified it is in relation to it could be your own experience, it could be an experience relayed through other people and society and culture and so on. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tradition of talking about reason in relation to critical thinking. And in a way, I think that's often unhelpful because although, just the process of connecting one belief to another is part of what critical thinking involves, is not what distinguishes it, really. You can use reasoning in all sorts of ways, often unhelpful ones. But what distinguishes critical thinking is contextualization, I think, and that's also what allies it to other kind of contextualizations. So like emotional, imaginative, mindfulness. These are all contextualizing processes, and critical thinking is another one of those. But it works at a more intellectual level. So yeah, different kinds of contextualization. One example is working with biases and fallacies. So there's two different parallel sources there. There's cognitive psychology, and there's the philosophical tradition of identifying fallacies, which often overlap in practice, even though they're in theory coming from different angles. Then they help to alert us to things we might be doing wrong, I think. So hasty assumptions we might be making. So that's one good prompt for context, I think, if we get familiar with biases and fallacies. So a simple example of that would be the ad hominem fallacy. So say if you're arguing on the internet and you start focusing on what somebody else is like as a person, even though that's not very relevant to the thing you're arguing about, then that's a distraction from the issue that you're supposedly putting forward a view about. So just that reflection that that's not a helpful move gives you a bit more context, just if you're aware of that possibility. So there are all sorts of sort of lists of biases and fallacies and things which can be useful as prompts in that respect. Yeah, another key area of critical thinking, I think, is credibility. So we get all sorts of sources of information from many different places, particularly in the context of the internet these days. How do we decide who to believe or what to believe? In many cases, we're not in a position to weigh it up for ourselves. Or to directly check anything for ourselves. We have to either believe one source or another source which contradicts it. So that's where I think it's crucial to, again, identify a context, a wider context in which you assess credibility. So how do you know how good a source this is? And there are procedures for doing that. So there's a mnemonic, a raven. So if you can go through a checklist of aspects of a source, which is useful to think about. So reputation, ability to observe, vested interest, expertise, and neutrality or bias. So that's that Raven acronym can help to remember some of the key issues in credibility. But very often also, I think it's just about considering the range of sources that are available on a particular issue. So where people run away with believing conspiracy theories, for example, they can often give you, well, maybe several sources of apparently authoritative people telling you this conspiracy theory is true, whatever. What everyone else is saying, the mainstream media, whatever, is false. But what people generally do in that, when they get sucked into that kind of rabbit hole, is not consider the other sources or weigh up positively what reasons there might be for believing those other sources, and perhaps the consensus of sources. So whether it's the Ukraine war is a current big example of that, I think. So there's people who disbelieve what the mainstream media is saying about it and believe the Russian narrative seem to be just not taking into account all the weight of highly credible sources, which are telling us things like the degree of atrocities the Russian forces have got into, for instance. Yeah. So it's taking as much as possible into account, I think, is a crucial aspect of credibility as well.
Yeah, it goes back to the kind of age-old problem of testimony, right? In epistemology, how, do we rely on testimony? What testimony do we rely on? I've not heard of the RAVEN acronym, so that's really useful. It sounds like you're falling towards consensus at some point has to be lent on, because I've done it myself. You can hear somebody really credible giving a kind of heterodox view, and I do find myself often drawn towards heterodox views because in history they've often turned out to be right. However, that might just be my own bias that I'm looking at the ones that did turn out to be right. So yeah, it's a bit of a mind pool. But I guess that's what the middle way is all about, right? It's about saying you don't have to take a view on everything. Sometimes you can understand there is a consensus without needing to be an expert on every topic that comes your way.
The middle bit is avoiding absolutes on either side.
Yeah.
But as for views about empirical matters, then it's very much needs to be driven by practicality, I think. So what we need to take a view on, and how well can we justify our view, and can we keep it provisional? So if we do take a view where there may be counter evidence, how easily can we adjust our view in the light of new evidence? And that's obviously another crucial aspect of critical thinking, and it connects closely to provisionality as a whole approach, which again is not just about reasoning, it's about being able to imagine other possibilities. And again, that seems to be the issue with conspiracy theories. It's not that people can't reason alternatives, it's that they don't imagine that there might be other strong ways, strongly justified ways of looking at something. So then, therefore, they don't take the trouble to investigate them. It's the imagination that's like the starting point, really.
Which I guess can be said of religion too.
Yeah, certainly polarized religious debates, or religion versus anti-religion. Yeah.
So yeah, we spoke about sort of fortifying your mind against extreme beliefs and dogmas, and I sense that's one of the key themes of the middle way. One way is critical thinking. Another may be meditation, because I believe meditation gives you the space to not be reactive, and that may at least buy you some time. Can you touch on that? How meditation has helped you to sort of embrace the middle way and avoid dogmatic beliefs?
Okay. Yeah. Well, again, I talked about context in relation to critical thinking, and it's the same with mindfulness and meditation practice. I think that the value of meditation practice is that it provides an immediate experiential context, so not conceptual context so much as a context, a kind of space in our minds, in our mental experience. And I think you can understand that particularly in terms of obsessive kind of states. So particularly, I mean, you can understand this even in neuroscientific terms. This is the kind of loop between the areas in the rear of our brain which are concerned with what's often known as the reptilian brain, which produces kind of instantaneous emergency reactions to things, which tends to produce either obsessive desire or anxiety of some kind. And if that is looped into beliefs in the prefrontal cortex, particularly left prefrontal cortex, which is connected to all our beliefs, and the way we linguistically articulate those beliefs, then we can end up in a loop in which these obsessive drives are constantly reinforcing our obsessive beliefs, which are reinforcing the drives, and so on. So that's what you experience easily, I think, in meditation. If once you sit down and, for example, try and focus on your breath, then you might realize how much you're going around in loops, constantly thinking about things which it's not actually helping you very much to carry on thinking about in this obsessive way. So what meditation does, I think, if one quietly persists in the practice, again, my experience is very much of embodiment being a key part of that. So we give those obsessive loops the context of an experience of having the body, and just of sitting there in a relaxed position or relaxed situation, then that enables those sorts of obsessive loops to not necessarily to disappear, but to be put in a bigger context. We're not going to lose those concerns, but they're no longer going to be the whole picture in the way in which they might have been otherwise. So in the immediate situation, we're then in a much better position to avoid absolute assumptions, which closely tied in with those obsessive states.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like we said, I guess it can just give you a little bit more space and the ability to maybe check thoughts that might be unconscious or slipping in. And in your website, you speak about a new approach to meditation, or certainly a unique approach to meditation. What does that entail?
I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. I wouldn't claim to have a unique approach to meditation, but I suppose the middle way is a distinctive approach to meditation, in that I think it's implicitly used in quite a few places, but it's often not brought out how central the middle way is to meditation. Although it's implicitly brought out, for example, in many of the Buddha's metaphors about meditation. So like the lute strings analogy, say. So when the Buddha was apparently talking to a monk who'd been struggling with his meditation, had previously been a musician before he became a monk. So he explained it to the monk by saying, it's when you're playing your lute, or the Indian equivalent of a lute at the time, then how do you tune your strings? They're neither too taut nor too slack. You won't get the right note if it's either. You can see that tautness or slackness as the extremes in the body. So there could be tautness in the body, too much stress, too much anxiety, or on the other hand, I'm not sure that it's too much relaxation exactly, but it's a lack of directionality in the way in which we're using the body. So a lack of consistency in the way we're approaching things is the other extremes. But either of those two extremes in the way we're using the body are also allied to beliefs. So absolute beliefs about what we're trying to do when we meditate, or indeed when we're doing anything. Yeah, there are a number of other metaphors like that which the Buddha uses, but so it's there in the, at least implicitly, in many of the ways that particularly Buddhist tradition talks about meditation. But you can also, I think, get a particular line on meditation by thinking about the middle way in relation to it, and seeing it as basically an application of the middle way, so that you're navigating using awareness broadly speaking of embodiment of the body, but can be funneled in various different ways depending on the kind of practice you're doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I'm always nervous to talk too much about meditation, because it can kind of become a loop in which a friend of mine says the West is often obsessed with the technology of meditation. And, for people like, for philosophers and academics, it can be easy to, I think, to get very lost in the cognitive side. For me, I'll think about it too much and not actually experience it. So appreciate the way you've kind of phrased it there. That's helped me flesh it out. So coming on to Buddhism, I think, there's no denying that Buddhism is one of the key inspirations for the middle way. For anyone listening who's not aware, essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the the historical Buddha was born as a prince, and he lived a life of luxury as a young man. And then he turned away and he spent time with kind of religious, almost extremists, and lived a life of deprivation and tried to almost starve himself. And then he found there was what he called the middle path, or the middle way, which was a way between the extremes. And I think for me, probably like a lot of people in the West growing up in a kind of Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition, that was really appealing. The sense that there was a middle way that had less dogma. However, it seems Buddhism is not immune to dogma, is not immune to being attached to ideas that may not have sort of initially come from it, kind of having cultural baggage attached to it. So could you just tell me a little bit about your sense of Buddhism? You kind of phrased yourself as not a Buddhist anymore. What were some of the aspects that led you to kind of reject the term Buddhist eventually?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to clarify that, but what I've rejected is the absolutizations in Buddhism, really. So, or the idea that by committing myself to the Buddhist tradition, I'm therefore accepting those absolutizations. So, in some ways, I'm still just as committed to the insights I got from the Buddhist tradition, which is what I'd articulate as the middle way.
Okay, so sorry to sort of rehash that question then. What are some of the absolutizations of Buddhism that you cannot accept?
Okay, well, there are fairly obvious things from the standpoint of most, informed Westerners approaching Buddhism, which they sometimes overcome because they feel they have to in order to practice Buddhism, which I don't think they do. So karma and rebirth is an obvious one, for example. Another common one also is absolutizing enlightenment, I think, and thus the authority of the enlightened. So if the Buddha said it, it must be right, or if the great Tibetan guru said it, it must be right, or whatever. So it's yes, there's a distinction really between practicing Buddhism as many Buddhists do, because the Buddhist tradition tells you to do certain things, and those will apparently give you a path to reality. That's the kind of absolutized interpretation of Buddhism, I think. On the other hand, there's Buddhism as a practice, which is a way of working forward from one stage to another, where one finds in one's experience. There's a great deal of that also in the Buddhist tradition, and the resources it gives us and the practices it gives us. But that's all been intermingled with absolutized interpretations quite often. So yeah, karma and rebirth is tied in with various dogmatic assumptions, sometimes moral assumptions, often assumptions about authorities. And you can see one of the outworkings of that, particularly in the sex scandals, which have overtaken various Buddhist groups in recent years, one of which I'm most familiar with is Sangharakshita and Triratna. So I've written a book about Sangharakshita, which unpicks some of that. So I think one of the reasons why there are sex scandals to such an extent, why they're such a problem, is that people tend to take the authority of Buddhist leaders absolutely, because that's so much part of the Buddhist tradition, and the tradition of sort of absolutizing enlightenment and thinking of the leader, even if they're not considered to be actually enlightened, as in some way a conduit of that enlightened perspective through the tradition. But at the same time, there are many Buddhist teachers, including Sangharakshita, who, at least most of the time, made it perfectly clear that they were fallible and that we needed to use our own judgment, and even provided resources and helpful approaches to doing that. So there's a great deal there, which can be very helpful if you interpret it in the right way, in the Buddhist tradition, and various ways of going wrong. And then there's, I don't know, would you like me to go on to talk about the middle way as it's understood in Buddhism? Because that's also an issue, possibly.
Yeah, for sure. I think my reflection on what you've just said is it can almost be disappointing when you're seeking for a truth or a path to kind of realize these things. You know, you get into, say, Buddhism, and you think, oh, this is it. This is an undogmatic path. And I think part of me wanted to ignore some of the more cultural trappings or the worship elements, or some of them, you know, the kind of more metaphysical elements that you can maybe not buy into. My kind of journey was always to lean towards more the original scriptures, the more Theravada path. I actually know very little about the school you mentioned, or the Mahayana teachings, but that was my understanding. But I did still think that you had to call yourself a Buddhist, you had to at least believe in the three basic facts of existence, which are, as you know, the rebirth, suffering, and impermanence. So to pick apart one of those, and to pick apart karma and rebirth, I guess, is quite fundamental. But yeah, that's just my reflection on that. But yeah, so please touch on how the middle way in Buddhism a bit more, and how that's kind of, I guess, what you can pick out from that.
Okay, just before I do that, just to respond to what you were saying,
Yeah.
I mean, suffering, particularly as an impermanence, can be interpreted in both either a metaphysical or a more practical way. So again, I think there are ways of absolutizing those insights, if you like. If you take, say, impermanence to be a metaphysical feature of the universe, then that can become a dogma. You're kind of you're expecting impermanence, or a lack of recognition of impermanence, to always be the problem. When actually, I think we sometimes prefer things to be impermanent. And so there's actually some complexity in the way that we we vary in the ways that we sometimes prefer things to be permanent, or we're deluded by the idea that they're permanent, and sometimes we're deluded by the idea that they're impermanent when actually they're going to carry on for longer. It's more like, if we focus instead, rather on how the universe is or how all conditions are, if we focus instead on the judgments that we make about it, I think that's much more helpful. And I think that's what those teachings are practically trying to get to, or can help us to get to. So impermanence, for example, the recognition that sometimes we absolutize our view of something, and part of that may be not recognizing that it changes, indeed that it's constantly changing, and that a person you may have met previously and judged to be a certain sort of person may have actually changed and improved or deteriorated, and so to be able to face up to and relate to that person in a helpful way, you need to be able to update your view of them, which involves provisionality again. So often those traditional teachings in Buddhism are taken metaphysically, but I take them often as pointing to the middle way. And if I could just maybe come back briefly to well, there's 5 principles of the middle way, which I briefly mentioned before. So skepticism, provisionality, incrementality, agnosticism, and integration. So kind of that's my breakdown of what the middle way involves. Now, just to say something about how that relates to the Buddhist account of the middle way, that was the kind of initial focus of my research in my PhD like 20 odd years ago. So I started off trying to understand Western philosophy and psychology and so on in relation to the Buddhist account of the middle way, which is the navigation between eternalism and nihilism. And what, well, again, you may get slightly different accounts from different Buddhists or different Buddhist schools about what eternalism and nihilism mean, but usually it's a cluster of absolute beliefs on either side of which are taken to always be associated with each other. So, for example, with eternalism, there's a belief that the self will always exist into the future. So you can talk about the eternal self or soul, and that's allied with a belief in cosmic justice of some kind. So that we'll always get our just desserts in future because we'll always exist in some sense. So whatever you do now, If you do something bad, then in the future, even if it's not in this life, in some future life, you will get punishment for what you did. And that also implies that you are responsible for what you did. So you haven't got a free will doctrine. So there's a cluster of beliefs there. There's the absolute self, eternal self, free will, metaphysical free will again, which gives you absolute responsibility, and cosmic justice. So the universe is all set up so that we get our just desserts. And then there's the opposite. On the other hand, there's what's known as nihilism, which then claims that there's no permanent self. Thus, it's assumed no responsibility and no comeback for our actions, which takes you straight into a kind of relativist view. Now, obviously, there's an insight there, an insight which I thought was worth exploring. And to start with, I tried to sort of categorize Western ethical philosophies as eternalist or nihilist, and that was what I tried to do in my PhD thesis. And it didn't really work because what I found increasingly was that philosophies didn't neatly fall into those clusters of beliefs. So you had some, for example, some philosophies like, say, Marxism, which is determinist, but actually has a kind of absolute ethical perspective as well, implicitly at least, and obviously doesn't believe in an eternal soul. But and then there are other modern philosophies which really aren't concerned with those categories. They have other ways of absolutizing rather than in those terms. So basically, it seemed to me that way of thinking about the middle way is a product of the Buddha's time and cultural circumstances, and maybe it worked then as a way of thinking about it, but the Buddhist tradition has hung on to that specific way of understanding what the middle way is. So to develop a more adequate understanding of the middle way today, I think we need a much more flexible view of it. So that's why I ended up thinking, well, actually, it's not about specific clusters of beliefs that have to be associated with each other, because they're not always associated with each other. Sure, absolute beliefs tend to cluster, but you can't always predict exactly how they will cluster. So what we just need to recognize is that there are absolute beliefs that tend to be opposed to each other. And in any given judgment, on any given occasion, we need to find the middle way. We need to find that space between those absolute beliefs, whatever they happen to be.
Yeah. No, there's a lot. There's so much there. I mean, I guess my understanding is that the theory of anatta or no self is the synthesis between the eternalism and the nihilism, right? It's sort of saying that you do carry moral responsibility, but ultimately you carry it on yourself, but ultimately that's an empty concept.
Yeah, I've often found that contradictory, at least in the way that Buddhist sources apply it, because on the one hand, there's this theory that we are still karmically responsible, or we're held responsible, as it were, by conditions, by the feedback we get from the universe, whatever we do that has moral weight. But at the same time, we don't have a self, so we're not the same self to be held responsible. So I end up feeling, well, you can't have it both ways. either there's some sort of feedback mechanism which works consistently for us, whatever us means, or there isn't. And we're better off letting go of that idea of this absolutely cosmic justice, this absolute feedback process, moral feedback process, if you like, and recognizing that, okay, there is often feedback to what we do. And yes, what we do has an effect. We definitely need to recognize that. But we really don't need absolute beliefs about a cosmic justice system to recognize that. We need to recognize that's an aspect of experience that we, actually, that this is the way Buddhism is often articulated, or karmic theory is often articulated by Buddhists in the West. Now, we ask them about karma and they say, oh, well, it's just actions have consequences, which sounds great. Who could disagree with that? Actions have consequences, but that's not traditional karmic theory. Traditional karmic theory says a lot more than that, makes a lot more claims than that. But if you do reduce it to actions of some kind have some sort of consequences, then, and we need to try and be aware of those consequences, put our actions in the bigger context where we recognize those consequences, then that's really what it's about.
Yeah, it's clear that Buddhism is a huge motivation and has a lot of value. So I guess the question is, how do we kind of take what we want and be honest to the texts or the tradition? But so I wanted to kind of moving out of the weeds of Buddhist philosophy to Tirolin House. So you offer retreats there. That's quite intriguing to me. What can one expect from a retreat? Is it a spiritual experience? Is it an intellectual experience? Is it a bit of both? What can one expect from a retreat there?
It's both, yeah. What one can expect from a retreat generally is a broad question, because it depends on where you're going on retreat and in what context and so on. But what a retreat means at Tirolin House is an opportunity to practice, in context of friendship with others, and a structure which helps you to practice. I've developed a kind of format for retreats in the Middle Way Society retreats, which does owe quite a lot to my previous experience of Buddhist retreats, but I've adapted in various ways. So you can expect some meditation, certainly, and just having the opportunity and perhaps the expectation to meditate is quite a big thing for many people, just to have a regular schedule where you spend maybe could just be 2 half-hour slots, but that's actually quite a lot for a lot of people to meditate. And but also artistic activity or appreciation is an important part of what we do on Middle Way Society retreats. So that could be using visual arts or literary arts or music or any of those, either appreciating or producing. So there's a variety of ways of approaching that, but the idea is to connect the imagination to what we're doing. But then the discussion is obviously an important part of it, and that's where the understanding theory of the middle way comes into it. That giving an overall format to what we're doing and understanding how we can avoid absolutization and what's involved in doing so, connecting the practice to intellectual assumptions and beliefs. But also the setting helps with the whole thing. So there's the social setting, there's other people who are trying to do the same thing and would be sympathetic, and again, just doing that can make a big difference to people for a extended period, even if it's just weekend. Then it's a different social context, and it can be quite an intensive context. You can end up with friendships even over a couple of days, which go more deeply than ones you might have in other contexts. And then there's the environment. So being able to be in a beautiful rural environment and just take space, go for walks and reflect and so on, is another aspect of the retreat experience.
Yeah, I'm certainly intrigued. I'm hoping to join one myself one day. So you might just see me in person. And I'll leave all the information in the show notes for the retreats and for your site. And before we close up, I was just curious, what's your current focus? I imagine it's running the retreats, but do you have you're an avid writer. Do you have any books on the go, or what's your current kind of intellectual focus? Because I imagine there's always an outlet.
Well, in terms of my books, the most recent one to have come out is The 5 Principles of Middle Way Philosophy. I mentioned the 5 principles just now. So it goes through those in detail. Then I've got one in the pipeline, which is called A Systemic History, which is written and submitted to the publisher, but it won't come out till 2024, some point in the middle of 2024 probably. So that deals with the biology and the psychological development and the cultural history behind the middle way. So it gives a different kind of context, which I haven't really tackled before in print, as to how the middle way and the necessity for it has arisen. It's also very much connected with systems theory and how we can understand well, I suppose particularly you can think of feedback loops from systems theory. So we can have kind of closed reinforcing feedback loops where we keep reproducing the same patterns, and we can also have adjusting or balancing feedback loops where we adjust what we're doing. And you can use that as a pattern to understand what's happening from the beginning of life all the way through evolution and through the individual development of individuals, and also in the ways that society has developed through history, through human history. So this is, it's not a sort of big explanatory history, because I'm trying to avoid creating kind of universal historical theories. But what I'm just trying to do is explain that bigger historical and biological background to the middle way, and provide what I hope is a cohesive view of why it's important and necessary from that point of view. So say that's been written and it's in the pipeline, and the book I'm just starting to engage with writing now is about embodied meaning. So this is the fourth in the series that I'm working on, new middle way philosophy series. So it began with absolutization, what the problem is, then the 5 principles, which is a practical approach to them, then the systemic history, which gives you certain kinds of background, and then I will be going into meaning, and that's the 4th volume, and after that looking at biases and critical thinking more, 5th volume, and the middle way in relation to philosophies, which is the 6th volume. So there'll be more detail on some, in those 4 through to 6 volumes on particular areas that may interest people.
Wow. That's certainly busy. Hope you give your mind a rest at some point.
I do a lot of gardening as well.
Nice. Yeah, you touched on the ecological side. Well, thanks so much, Robert. There's so much there, but I'll leave all the information in the show notes and the links to your books. I think the middle way is a really, really important concept, as I said, in today's times when we're bombarded with so much information, so much dogma. So yeah, hopefully that's something good for people to chew on. And thanks again for your time today.
Thanks very much for the conversation. I enjoyed it.
And that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed that chat with Robert and the introduction to the Middle Way Society. I know it's a really valuable tool for me for navigating between extremes, and I'm really interested to see what happens next with the society, and potentially attend one of their retreats quite soon, so I might get back to you on what that is all about. But yeah, thanks for listening today. As I say, you can check out the Mind Forest YouTube page at Mind Forest Philosophy. We're also on Spotify, Instagram, and a few other bits and pieces. We've got some really interesting guests coming up, so do keep an eye on the show. And that is all for now. I'll see you on the other side.